We've been in this series on shame. And if you remember when we started the series, I started talking about Brene Brown and this article she wrote. And what she wrote was that when it comes to shame, it's something that we all have. And that we are all afraid to talk about. But yet, the less we talk about it, the more that it controls us. And quite frankly, none of us want to live shame-based, shame-filled lives. We all know the weight of shame. It's one of the heaviest things that a human life can carry. And we've learned a lot throughout this series. We've learned the difference between guilt and shame. And that's a very important difference. You see, guilt is saying, I did that. Whereas shame is saying, I am that. We learn that being unashamed is how God created us to be. And that when sin entered the picture, that's when shame exploded onto the scene. Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, they started off naked and unashamed. But after they sinned against God, they tried to cover up their shame. They tried to cover up their nakedness because of that shame. And we learned that nakedness in the Bible is a big idea. Not so much in the physical sense of being naked, but in the relational sense of being naked. Before sin, it meant being authentic, transparent, vulnerable, reading truth and courage. But after that, it meant having our sin being laid out before the entire world, leading us to hide from both God and each other. But what can we do with our shame? We learn that the antidote to shame is coming out into the open with whatever it is that's making us feel that shame. Out in the open with God and out in the open with others. And when we looked at how Jesus interacted with people who came to him with their shame, in honesty and transparency, we found that it was always met the same way, with grace and forgiveness, healing and restoration, acceptance and support. But here's how I wanted to end this series. Why is it that Jesus can take away our shame? Why is it that when we talk about the cross, that we say it takes care of, or can take care of, our sin and our shame? And something that has always intrigued me is when people say something to this effect. You know, never really understood why Jesus had to die in the first place. I never really understood all this cross stuff. I know what sin is, and I certainly know what my shame is about. But if the cross is really going to intersect the needs of my life, and if you're telling me that it does, explain to me how that works. What's the story behind it? So what I want to do this week, we're going to do a little Theology 101. It's the beginning of the school year. PTA's already been there 2 days. Some of you haven't gone back yet. Feel lucky. But to start a new school year, I thought we'd do a little Theology 101. And I'm going to give you some background issues. We're going to go through 5 different background issues and what the cross is really about when we look at it. The first of these issues is to understand behind the whole idea of the cross is the very nature of God. And what needs to be understood about the nature of God is his holiness and his love. Because God is both holy and loving. He is truly perfect and holy. Sin is repulsive to him. He's allergic to it. Cannot look upon it. His holiness demands either the removal or the destruction of sin. But God is also which means that when you want to try to understand God's activity, that understanding often lies at the intersection of his holiness and love, where those two come together. The second thing to understand is God's spiritual and moral law, his rights and his wrongs, his standards and his dictates. And that is not necessarily something impersonal and foreign to God. But instead, it's the very expression of God's person and God's will. You know, it's not always something that he arbitrarily has said. The law is God, and God is the law. It's who he is, his very nature, his very character. And as a result, our whole interaction with the law is deeply relational and personal. And it's God who we either obey or disobey. When we obey God, it's an act of love. When we disobey him, it's an attack on his very nature. The equivalent of cosmic treason. And the penalty of sin is as serious as it gets. What could be worse than to go against and declare war against the very nature and character of God? To willfully go against it. And we see that in Romans. Famous verse that almost everyone knows. For the wages of sin is death. We're familiar with that reality of physical death. The Bible also, though, teaches about the reality of spiritual death, which is separation from God. You see, sin causes spiritual death. It breaks the relationship that we have with God. It destroys the intimacy that God intended to take place between himself and all of his creation, including us. Because at its heart, sin is rebellion against God and against his character. For the punishment or the consequences are not simply a possibility, but they are inevitable. Which brings us to the third thing that we have to look at. The issue of the human condition. All of us, every single one of us, are sinners. All of us are in this same sin condition. And we cannot save ourselves. We can't lift ourselves out of sin. And the word sin, what I thought was very interesting, the word sin is actually an archery term. It literally means to miss the mark, to fall short. The original use of the term would be when somebody would shoot an arrow. If they missed the target, it was called a sin. It didn't matter whether you missed by an inch or a mile. It was still a sin. With that image in mind, take notice of how the Bible describes the human condition. In Romans chapter 3, it says, "For all have sinned. All fall short of God's glorious standard." When it comes to living life the way that God intended, we are all missers of the mark. Some of us may be better at aiming than others, but no one hits the bullseye every time. You see, sin isn't just about a failure to be perfect. It's also about willful choices that we make. Conscious decisions that we make to knowingly go against God's leadership. It's a choice that we've made with our very soul to go against the moral law and the will of God, which makes sin serious business. We looked at Romans 6:23 already, but I want to look at a different version of that verse. When people sin, they earn what sin pays: death. We can't change that. We can't address it. We can't fix it. We are totally unable to rescue ourselves from our sinful condition. Salvation by works, impossible. There is nothing that we can do to right ourselves before God. Which brings us to the fourth background issue: the Old Testament sacrificial system. And this can be confusing to some people, but it's really important to understand. In ancient times, the Bible teaches that God decreed the payment for wrongdoing, for sin, to be covered through the blood of an animal. Though a rebellion deserved death, God's love allowed for our sin to be addressed through the sacrifice of an animal. And this seems strange to us today, but it's very intentional by God. He wanted people to see the severity of their sin. He wanted people to see that paying for the sin that comes between us and Him, that it's messy, that it's gruesome, that it's costly. Because sin is messy, gruesome, and costly. It really is a life and death issue. The symbol of an animal sacrifice was a real one. The sacrifice was a substitute for the sinner. It bore the sinner's guilt. And that's where we get the term scapegoat. We've heard of people being called a scapegoat, being made out to be a scapegoat, blaming them for something else. It's a biblical term. The annual Day of Atonement, the priest would make atonement for all the sins of all the people. The scapegoat was the goat that they would symbolically place all of those sins onto that one goat. And then you drive it out into the wilderness. Animal sacrifice also had to be without blemish, without a mark. And that's also significant because the point was that sin or imperfection could only be addressed by perfection. Sin can't deal with sin. It can only be dealt with by God Himself. Sin was against Him and His law, and only He could offer true forgiveness. That sacrificial system was only a sign, it was a precursor of what God would ultimately do. It wasn't something that would finally and ultimately bridge the gap between us and God. Which is why throughout the Old Testament, the great prophets of God said that there would be one to come, one from God, who would take away the sins of the world once and for all. One sacrifice for all of us. Then at that point in time in history that God chose for reasons known only to Himself, He did just that. He provided a perfect, once-for-all sacrifice for the sins of all people throughout all time and history. Which brings us to the fifth background issue: Jesus Christ. You see, Jesus was the fulfillment of that sacrificial system. And because of Him, we can now be forgiven once and for all. As John the Baptist said, upon seeing Jesus, "Behold the Lamb who takes away the sin of the world." You see, God cannot deal with sin except as his holiness allows. If he did not punish it or make adequate satisfaction for it, he would be forgiving it unjustly, which God can't do. Some people say, well, why can't he just forgive? Why do we have to have death? Why is that so necessary? You see, to simply forgive out of mercy or to redeem with a wave of the hand would cause God to cease to be God. He is holy, and his holiness demanded what sin demands, a just penalty, the death penalty. His love mixed with his holiness means that he took our place. I can use some lawyer terms and a little lawyer story. Let me try and explain it to you. Imagine that you're brought to trial for vehicular homicide. You're driving down the road speeding when you hit and kill the little girl coming home from school. You're brought to trial. The evidence is presented. The jury returns a verdict of guilty. And from the bench, the judge says, I sentence you to death. But then he does something really strange. With compassion in his eyes, he gets up from the bench, takes off his robe, walks down to where you stand, embraces you, and says, but I love you. The penalty must be carried out, for I am an honest and a good judge, and what you did was wrong. It must be paid for. But I love you, and do not want to see your life end this way. Justice must be carried out, so I will go in your place. And that's what Jesus did for you and for me. Like the parent who would say they would do anything to make a child well, God does whatever it takes to make us well. In Romans, we read these verses. We can understand someone dying for a person worth dying for. And we can understand how someone good and noble can inspire us to selfless sacrifice. God put his love on the line for us by offering his son in sacrificial death while we were of no use whatever to him. And that is the sacrifice that he made for us. He didn't just die for sin. He died for our shame. You see, when Jesus went to the cross, he took on both our sin and our shame. The Bible says this about the death of Jesus in the book of Hebrews. Jesus endured the cross, scorning the shame. You see, the cross was a sin-filled, shame-filled event. The goal of crucifixion was not simply to execute someone, but to simultaneously humiliate them, shame them as much as possible. And one of the ways they did this was to strip them of all of their clothes, parade them through the streets on the way to the place of crucifixion, which was a public place, as public as possible, where people would be walking by. And then, while still naked, they would be nailed to the cross. And they let them hang there in their shame before any and all passers-by until they died. Jesus was no exception. I know every painting we ever see, he has a loincloth on. That's artistic modesty. Jesus did not have a loincloth on when he was crucified. He would have been laid bare before the world in as humiliating a way as possible. Before his friends, before strangers, before his mother, before the entire world. Jesus went to the cross anyway, scorning its shame. Why did he do it? He did it because of what the shame of the cross would allow, which is closing your shame, taking away your shame and my shame. He let himself be exposed so that shame could die there on the cross, along with our sin. When we started this series, you may remember how we looked at the Garden of Eden, and after Adam and Eve had rebelled against God, what God did. They were dealing with that sin, this newly felt shame, and even then God met them with mercy. Knowing how they were feeling, he made them clothes and covered them. See, what began there in the Garden of Eden, with God providing clothes for Adam and Eve to cover up their shame, ended with Jesus on the cross, covering all of our shame completely. In 1 Peter, we read, "The one who trusts in him will never be put to shame." It can't be, because their shame died on that cross. And I don't know if you want in on that, but you can't. You see, Christ offers that forgiveness, that acceptance, that release to everyone as a gift. If you want it, if you pray to receive it, you'll get it. And as I was preparing the sermon this week, I was reminded, and it kept coming back over, and throughout the week I was humming this. I'm not singing because it made people uncomfortable. I was humming this African American spirit that kept coming into my mind. Were you there when they crucified my Lord? Were you there when they nailed him to the cross? Were you there when they pierced him in the side? Were you there when the sun refused to shine? And the answer can be yes. You can say that you were there. You can say that it was your place that he took. That it was your sin. That it was your shame that took him there. You can say I was there because Jesus was there. And have what he did apply to you. Perhaps it's time for you to whisper a prayer for maybe the first time this morning. And it's a prayer that I'm going to end us with today. It's a short prayer. And if it's something that you want to say, just repeat it to yourself. And commit your life to what Jesus has done for us. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, I want my sin and my shame on that cross. I want forgiveness. I want healing. I want to be in a relationship with God through Christ. And I want to say that I was there when they crucified my Lord. Lord, may that be all of our prayers. We ask this in your Son's name. Amen.